So I hope you all had a fantastic weekend. It was lovely this weekend. And this next week, I want you to be focusing on summer goals. And my hope is that really the only seesaw lesson I really want you to hone in and focus and do your really best effort with is the student-led conference planning sheet that we have attached as a seesaw form. You will get, I'm really sorry, you will get a paper copy in the mail. So really for just Monday and Tuesday, I just want you to be thinking about, what do I want to set my summer goal in math? What do I want my summer goal to be like in reading? What personal goal do I have? So be thinking about moving forward through the summer and how you're going to keep yourself accountable. There are other things on Seesaw you are more than welcome to do. I love seeing your work. I love that you are all continuing to work hard, but make the student-led conference your priority. Your parents have started signing up for the conferences, so thank you, parents. That helps me figure out my life and schedule. And I cannot wait to talk about all the wonderful things you've done this year and also just talk about how you're going to push yourself this summer, because you've already pushed yourself so hard. So when we left on Friday, Calvin's dad, who was not that great of a sounding guy, he kind of sounded like he was a little bit short-tempered. And it just seemed like he was really pushing Calvin in really negative ways, not helping him reach goals, but kind of belittling him and making fun of him and making him feel bad about himself. So that made me sad for Calvin. So let's find out what happens for the rest of chapter 8. His pocket beeped. Calvin's dad pulled out his phone and checked the message. "You've got to be kidding me. Can't anyone do their job right?" he barked at the screen. Glancing up at Calvin, he frowned. "I've got to take care of this. When I get back, I want all your homework done." Calvin slumped in momentary relief as his father stalked to his home office, phone already pressed to his ear. With a deep sigh, Calvin bent and rescued the pencil from the floor. Straightening, he peered down at the page again. Maybe if he squared both sides, he'd figure out how to move X. As Calvin tackled the math, an old pressure tugged in his chest. He rubbed his shirt unconsciously and bit his lip before remembering that was also a bad habit that showed weakness. Slowly, he cracked the mystery of X, but the pressure in his chest built until he couldn't ignore it anymore. He knew what it was. It was the same nagging sense that had once led him to a pup trapped in the drainage ditch, unable to scramble up its steep sides. After Calvin boosted it out, the puppy had licked all over his face, its tongue warm and sticky, its breath smelling faintly of chewed-up grass. He'd known that what his parents would say, but he tried bringing it home anyway. Predictably, his mother had shrieked in alarm and his father had ordered, "Get that thing to the shelter! Now!" Calvin had never felt as horrible as when he'd handed the puppy over, for its trusting eyes saying it knew he'd come back for it soon. Even though it was a no-kill shelter, Calvin had researched it thoroughly. He knew puppies had a higher chance of adoption. There were still times he worried how and where it wound up. Tugging in his chest was now an instinctive yank, like someone had lassoed his heart and lungs. A roar emerged from his dad's office before his voice settled back into its usual cutting tyrant. From the sounds of it, his dad would be tied up for a while. Might as well investigate where his institution or universe or whatever was tugging at him wanted him to go. Oh, not institution, intuition. Ha! See? That's one of those strategies, readers. When you read it and it doesn't quite make sense, you go back and check it. So that applies for 36-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds. Go back and double check. So it was his intuition or the universe or something tugging at him. Shoving down the feeling of guilt, Calvin swept his workbooks and school supplies off the table and stuffed them into his backpack by the door. He could always stay up late to finish. It wasn't like his parents would expect him to hang out with them after dinner or anything. As soon as he was outside, his muscles relaxed. It was impossible to feel stressed on such a gorgeous day, with the slight breeze softening the heat of the sun into a delicious warmth. Whistling to himself, Calvin set off, letting the feeling lead him down the block. As the manicured lawns of his neighborhood gave way to a small strip of stores, he peered into the window of a comic book shop, wondering if they had the latest edition of his favorite graphic novel. Unfortunately, he'd left his wallet at home. Besides, the tugging was pulling him onward, beyond the store. The houses on the other side were more neglected, as were the sidewalks, the slabs poking up unevenly. It was getting late, and Calvin knew he should turn back, head back for home, but that feeling in his chest just would not let him go. A yard full of twinkling wind chimes made him pause and smile at the colorful garden spinners. Light bounced off the whirling metal arms, dancing over his face. It was a place full of joy, but it wasn't where he was supposed to be. And since a sensation pulled him to the left, and he crossed the street, turned the corner to an abandoned-seeming stretch of houses with shagging porches. To his surprise, Meg Murray and her kid brother were standing on the sidewalk with an enormous black lab panting happily between them. "Don't be like me," Meg was saying. "What's wrong with being like you?" Calvin asked. Meg was one of the most intriguing kids at school. She didn't worry what other people thought of her. She was who she was. But as the words popped out of his mouth, he felt the back of his neck heat up. "You've got a pretty good arm," he added quickly. "What?" Meg asked, her eyebrows furrowed. "Veronica, direct hit," Calvin explained, tossing an imaginary ball her way. Meg shifted on her feet, her smile tight. She hoped he wouldn't offend her by bringing it up. A head of floppy brown hair appeared at his waist, cutting between him and Meg. "Hi, I'm Charles Wallace," Meg's brother piped up. "You're Calvin, aren't you?" "I am," Calvin replied. How did Charles Wallace know him? Did Meg talk about him at home? "What are you doing here?" Meg asked. She didn't sound mad, just curious. "I don't know," Calvin began. He glanced around again in the neighborhood. "I was doing my homework, and then all of a sudden I just felt like I had to come here." He gazed around back to Meg. She was staring at him. "Is that weird?" "Maybe a little," she answered, her nose wrinkling up in humor. "You're here because I called you here with my mind," Charles Wallace explained. His voice and expression were deadly serious, no hint of humor in them. Calvin felt more than he saw Meg. All right, so I've got to get this one together. Calvin felt more than he saw Meg suck in her breath, as though bracing herself for Calvin's answer. She needn't have worried. He loved younger kids and had always wanted a sibling himself and wished he had Charles Wallace's confidence. "Really? So you have superpowers?" Calvin said, leaning down. "Something like that," Charles Wallace shrugged. "And I really think we could use a guy like you. You're good at diplomacy." "What do we need diplomacy for?" Meg asked, winding the dog's leash around her hand and then spooling it out again. The dog rolled its eyes up at her as though telling her to hold still. Charles Wallace gently shook his head. "The fact that you asked that is exactly why we need it." He turned back to Calvin and faced him. "What do you say, Calvin? Want to come with us?" Calvin stood up and smiled happily at Meg. He had no idea where he was going, but it sounded like fun. The pressure in his chest had eased. So apparently the invisible force wanted him here with them? Why not? "Great!" Charles Wallace held out his hand and solemnly shook Calvin's as though they had just agreed to undertake a wilderness expedition together. "Let's meet Mrs. Who." With that mysterious statement, Charles Wallace skipped across the street. For the first time, he seemed like the little boy he was, hopping one stair at a time up the steps of an old house with boarded-up windows. Considering its condition, the house's only occupants should be ghosts and mice. "Charles Wallace, come down from here." "From there," Meg said sternly, but Charles Wallace ignored her. He gave a quick knock at the door, and it swung inward. Meg stalked on the edge of the sidewalk. "Do not go in there," she ordered. Her brother beamed back at her as though she told him an amusement park lay inside, and slipped through the door. "Ugh!" Meg gritted her teeth beside Calvin. "Fearless little guy," he said. "Unfortunately," she muttered, tugging her dog to standing. She stomped across the street, paused at the bottom step to loop the leash around the rail. What an interesting family, Calvin thought, as he followed her up the stairs. I wonder who Mrs. Who could be. Chapter 9. Tessering. So tomorrow, it sounds like we might be going on an adventure to a different space and time. I don't know. We'll have to find out. All right, so remember, your jobs this week. 1, come to the virtual class meetings. It's really, really amazing when I get to see you all. 2, focus on student-led conferences. 3, make sure you're still reading in a book. All right? All right, you ready? Hands in. 1, 2, 3. Break, go.